is it really the best thing to start off with? Alluding to the C-bomb, joking about clowns, when you yourself have said, I want a kinder, better politics. I just think it gives completely the wrong message. And we all like a joke, and it's good to bring people along with you using humour. But nobody wants their MP or leader of their party to be the next stand-up comedian in the local pub, do they?
Welcome back to Veterans in Politics, our special segment which is titled Behind the Politics, where every now and again we bring in experts from behind the scenes, and we return this week with Lydia Ball, my wife. You have heard her dulcet tones before during previous seasons as our intro artist, and I always thought we were missing a trick about not getting her insights, of which we began this season with. How you been?
Good, busy. We've not long got back from the Invictus Games.
I know. That was good, wasn't it?
It was incredible. An amazing experience, exhausting. It's kind of like party conference, but longer, more clapping, and you still get the flu afterwards.
Yeah. It was. Do you know what? That's a really good analogy, because we are going to be talking today about the party conference season with a little bit of a focus on the Liberal Democrat conference that's just finished. But it did strike me that apart from all the amazing inspirational stuff, which you tend not to get in spades at party conferences, let's face it, but there was a bit of a feel about conference, because it was completely exhausting, not just for me as an athlete competing and for you supporting as the family members, but when you and I were sat watching things like wheelchair rugby and going from one event to the next, it very much felt like a conference, didn't it?
It did. And you also had that bubble of you're kind of in it, and it's everything you live and breathe for, how long were we there? Just over a week.
Yeah.
And then you kind of come out of the bubble and life is as normal.
So if you have been under a rock or it has escaped your attention, I was a member of Team UK for the Invictus Games. Proud to say that I've come back with a medal.
I hope you're going to show your medal.
Oh, no, because it's in the office. I'm not gonna be. Everyone
You're
always
a rubbish
says,
medalist. You never take it anywhere.
wherever I've gone, everyone's like, where's your medal? I'm like, is that a thing? Is that what you're meant to do? You're meant to be like walking around with it all the time? And everyone said, absolutely, you're meant to be walking around. But anyway, I don't. Because believe it or not, I'm not that vain. It's on the shelf in the office. For those that do want to see it, then give me a shout. But I did get across the 3 sports. I did indoor rowing, where I got personal best. We did cycling, where I was able to confront my fears and get back on 2 wheels after having had a motorcycle accident. And then lastly, where I got my medal was in powerlifting, which was my first event. And I basically got the 3rd prize, which is a bit of a theme when we're talking about the Liberal Democrats, because traditionally the Liberal Democrats have always been the bronze medalists. But around about 2015 in the general election there, they were overtaken by the SNP as the 3rd party in British politics. So that starts our theme really. When it comes to the Liberal Democrats, I think my first question to you, as Adam Bolton, the Sky News journalist, as I've read an article recently, he had an article saying, is it time to take the Lib Dems seriously again? What do you think?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the question kind of implies that nobody took them seriously in the first place, and I think it's a tricky one, because obviously, yes, they were in coalition government in 2010. And I think history shows that actually they did quite well in government. They were in all of the governmental departments. They kind of punched above their weight. They held the Conservative Party to account on a lot of areas that otherwise actually they might have just had free rein on. And I think in hindsight they were fairly effective. I think they lost their way after that, because they after 2010, I think they fought the next election in 2015, kind of admitting failure, but I don't think that was accurate, and I think they did themselves down somewhat. And then they just kind of lost their way, and every political party loses their way. Everyone goes into the wilderness at some point. The Conservatives were in the wilderness for the entire 90s. Labour were in the wilderness under Jeremy Corbyn, seem to be, manoeuvring things back again. And I think the same is true of the Lib Dems. And we've recently watched through Sir Ed Davey's speech, which was interesting for kind of two reasons: what was in it and also what was not in it.
Yeah, and we'll pick up on that. I think the most objective view we can offer, though, in terms of that comment losing their way, is in the ballot box. I mean, in 2015, the Lib Dems ended up with 8 MPs, and we saw the SNP with 56, whereas under the leadership of the late Charles Kennedy, popular figure in British politics, he had 62 MPs when he was leader, versus the SNP at 6. So the Scottish factor has definitely had something to play. I look back at the coalition years quite fondly, if I'm honest. The Cameron-Clegg relationship seemed to gel and work.
Yeah.
And like you said, they had a senior Lib Dem in every department. There's been some arguments saying, well, should they have been given a department to run as a party? That's another interesting take. But yeah, slightly lost in the wilderness, but they have been the bronze medalists in the past. They certainly aren't that now. And getting that bronze medal back would give them so much more clout. It will give them positions on national media, and it would also give them a couple of questions at PMQs every week, again raising their profile. So do you think that there's hope for the Lib Dems in terms of what you've seen so far?
Yes, I do. I do. I think the majority of the topics that have kind of come out of their conference are topical, for starters. They are actually talking about issues that the majority of the media are talking about, most families are talking about. So their fairer deal, which is around the economy, around the NHS, around the climate crisis and the cost of living crisis, are all very pertinent issues which, were we to have an autumn election, would be fitting for now. Is it fitting for a year's time? Maybe, maybe not. Some of the issues definitely will still be live then. But no, I think they are making a fairly decent comeback. But interesting what you said about the whole Scotland narrative and what we've noted from Ed Davey's speech. No real mention of the union in there, and that is their way back into a stronger position in Parliament. They need to be winning the seats in Scotland. They need to effectively fight Labour for the SNP space in order to make headway in the UK Parliament. So can they do that? What is their offer to Scotland?
So let's pick up on that speech from Ed Davey, because there were a couple of things that we noticed. Like you said, it's quite notable by the things that were missing. I think the biggest point as well, I mean, structurally, because I love to talk about speech writing and delivering communications, that there was a really strong element in the speech, and that was when he was talking about his own familial relationship with cancer, having lost. He was 4 years old when he lost his dad. He was 38 when he died, and then cared for his mother in his teens. I think he was 15, and that came quite a way into the speech. I personally would have kicked off that story because he completely had me. And I think anyone listening, anyone in the UK, we've all been affected by cancer. You know, we lost my sister 5 years ago to it. And you could have heard a pin drop in the room when he gave that very powerful personal account of his experience of cancer. And then that obviously leads into themes around the NHS and care. I think he should have kicked off with that. Instead, though, he didn't kick off with that. He kicked off with a really crass joke around the C word. Yeah. And I don't know about you, but I found in an era where politicians have got to be a bit more responsible with their language, particularly in speeches like this, keynote speeches, that was a bit crass. And in the context of that later story around cancer, it just didn't do that justice. I mean, what were your thoughts about the structure of the speech?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I liked what he was trying to do. He was trying to do a no-note speech, similar to what we've seen David Cameron do and Obama in America do. I don't think it particularly suits his delivery style to do that kind of speech, because he had a lot of pauses that were slightly awkward. But when it comes to the content, I completely agree with you. I too would have started with the story, because you've got to get people emotionally hooked in. And I didn't like his opener for several reasons. And we talked about this in the last episode that we did together, which is all about the violence and anger and threat in public life towards particularly MPs, but I appreciate other people have those kind of threats as well. Is it really the best thing to start off with, alluding to the C-bomb, joking about clowns, when you yourself have said, I want a kinder, better politics? I just think it gives completely the wrong message. And we all like a joke, and it's good to bring people along with you using humour. But nobody wants their MP or leader of their party to be the next stand-up comedian in the local pub, do they? No. They're looking to them to be serious. Yes, you can have some light-hearted moments, but I just felt that opener was completely off, didn't fit with the rest of his speech at all. It seemed like it just kind of sat there, as though he didn't really know how to start it. Whereas you're right, if he'd started off with his own experience, you've got everyone hooked, they're listening to you, and now they're going to find out what you're going to do to make people's lives better. And I think, the content of the rest of his speech was really good. And one complaint people often have of politicians is that, so you've pointed out the problem, what are you going to do about it? Well, he actually gave answers to all of those questions. We started it off saying, what is this fairer deal that's sloganed across the stage? Well, I'm pretty clear what it is now and what he wants to do to achieve those goals, which we'll see if Sir Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak manage to do similar. I hope they can. But yeah, it was interesting, and just for me, a disappointing start and not kind of the right tone.
I think with any speech, you have to ask yourself the question, who is the target audience, or what is the target audience? Clearly that opening gag was to the Lib Dem faithful in the room. But when they give these speeches, politicians need to understand that they're there anyway. They're going to pay their money and go to the conference. They are the party faithful, right? You and I have been in that number where we've gone to conferences. But it's the people. This is the moment to talk to people outside of the room, which he achieved with that cancer story. So I just think it was needless, that silly little gag at the beginning. And if he'd have started with the cancer story, he appeals not just to the party faithful, but to everyone inside and outside of the room. So bit of a bit of good and bad assessment of bag, if you're listening, Ed Davey, a mixed bag. Well done on that cancer story. You got us, because cancer's affected both our family, and both sides of our family, and affects everyone. So it was a really, really good thing, and actually to focus on that as a political issue when people aren't talking about it, and you Ed said, we need to talk about cancer. I commend you for that. It was really, really good. So coming back to the speech, some elements of it, the one thing that you picked up on, I think he only spoke about the Labour Party once. Now we know that in order to get anywhere the next general election, Ed Davey came second in 80 Conservative seats. Well, the Liberal Democrats came second in 80 Conservative seats in 2019. Clearly, going after Conservative voters is their strategy, but it's a question of how they're going to get there. The whole speech was littered with basically Conservative bashing, understandable, given that's the maths. But what's your analysis on why he only mentioned the Labour Party so few times, whereas it was all about having it at the Conservatives? Why do you think that was his approach?
Coalition. That's why that's his approach, in my view.
Okay, expand.
He seems to be very wary. We've listened to a couple of podcasts that he's done now, and he's very wary to commit the Liberal Democrats to going into coalition with the Labour Party, which, in my view, given the political numbers at the moment, is the only realistic chance we have of not having a hung parliament at the next election. The result from 2019 was so huge for the Conservative Party that actually to overcome that, it would be difficult for any one party to do. Similar to the Labour landslide in 1997. No party in 2001 could ever have overturned Tony Blair's majority then. It's impossible. Statistically, it cannot happen. But what you can have is a hung parliament like we saw in 2010, which then leads to a coalition, or you just decide to go like Theresa May did in 2017 and go for a kind of a grace and favour option of buying in some votes from another party, which I suppose is also open to Labour. But I think that is why he didn't talk about the Labour Party. The only mention he made of them was when discussing the Lib Dems' relationship with Europe, which also, a bit of an odd one. We all know that they're a pro-European party, and yet there was a lot of holding back from Ed Davey on what the Lib Dems would want their relationship with Europe to look like. He said, tear down trade barriers and improve the relationship, which is very loose. That could mean anything. That isn't a rejoining of the EU. That isn't a campaigning to rejoin the EU. Similarly, he made no other reference to trade deals anywhere outside of the EU either. So I'm, having heard his speech, I'm slightly unclear. Yes, I know they're pro-European, but I don't actually know what they want to do with Europe as a result of that. And I think, and that is my sense as to why there was so little Labour chat, in that Labour have just come out and said they would look to renegotiate the deal that Britain got with the EU. And that slightly more aligns with what Ed Davey has said than obviously what a current Conservative government would do. So perhaps he is not going all out on Europe, even though there's clearly a market for that, clearly in the electorate. When you've got the Conservatives and Labour saying a similar thing, the Lib Dems surely are going to shoehorn in saying, we're all out, we do believe in the EU and we think the UK should be part of that. Because there is a constituency of people that still want to be part of the EU.
Yeah, and that's my theory too. So I think in terms of those 2 points, the reason he didn't bash the Labour Party too much, because he's keeping one eye on coalition. Yeah. So being close, being friendly, as it were, towards them in the main on some of the general issues like the NHS, the economy, etc. So he didn't go after Starmer at all on that, or any of the reported flip-flopping of policies that have been out there in recent times. That would have been easy for him to do. He didn't do that. I think he's also done that in order to go for more apathetic Labour voters who might then deem them as a nice party, not bashing or offending them personally in terms of their choices about voting Labour, and trying to woo them over perhaps, as well as keeping friends with the Labour Party for any potential coalition going forward. Yeah. And then on Europe, when we listened to that speech, the loudest cheer was when Ed Davey started speaking about Europe. Yeah. So his own activist base, his own party, the party faithful, clearly a pro-European, but also just was slightly under half the country in that referendum.
49, yeah.
And when you've got a fag paper between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party when it comes to the approach on Europe, I think he's missed a campaigning opportunity in that speech to go after, if he's going to go after those 80 seats where they came second, well, they're going to be, by and large, a lot of Remainy type areas and votes. Yeah. And he's got nothing to lose by coming out a bit more pro-Europe, because we all know the Liberal Democrats aren't going to be the leading party in government. Yeah. But they might be in a hung parliament involved. So in order to get there and to gain more MPs, I think he could come out a little bit more pro-Europe, if I'm honest. Yeah. I mean, you worked in Brussels. You know more about it than I do. Do you think that would be a sensible tactic?
I do. I think especially as on all of the major issues, you look at the cost of living crisis, the economy, the NHS, education. As you say, there's a fag paper between all of the parties on those issues. And if you're going to stand out, you need to be saying something that's a bit different, a bit more radical, I guess. and staking claim on the one issue that you own, which is being pro-European, and I mean that in the institution sense, not, we all love Europe. But I think staking your claim on that would be a wise move for him. And yes, if you look at the places and the parts of the country that he's looking to take over, I mean, he gave his election strategy in his speech. They're going after the blue wall. There's 80 seats that he is going after. He's not touching Labour, doesn't mention the red wall, doesn't mention any Labour seats. They're going after the blue seats because they want to see the Conservatives out of government.
And they even had those Lego bricks, right, of the blue wall.
Absolutely. So that being your policy, you then look to where he's recently made gains, which is the southwest, and you look then at the impact of leaving the EU on particular communities in the southwest. For example, fisheries and some export businesses. There was a programme recently done on the BBC about it, and you can see why they would be slightly more pro-European, or even pro-breaking some of the regulation that is preventing them from continuing business as they did before. I don't understand what he's got to lose in coming out kind of all guns blazing on the EU issue.
And they've done pretty well in by-elections of late. Next one coming up, I mean, there's one up in Scotland, so that'll be a bit of a test on that balance of the SNP. But we've also got Mid-Bedfordshire, and the Lib Dems fancy themselves in that by-election. You and I both lived in that constituency.
We did.
Nadine Dorries was our MP, and so we know the place well. I've worked in the constituency as well with the army, with the intelligence corps based in Chicksands. I mean, Lib Dems. Realistic chances in October for Mid-Beds?
I mean, statistically not. If you look at the data, they came third in 2019. They've historically come third there. Bear in mind, Labour's second, they were way out as well. I mean, the Lib Dems have got a mountain to climb if they want to win that seat. Not saying it's completely impossible, but they've got a heck of a lot of work to do to win.
What about the local elections, though?
Yeah, the local elections were interesting. You and I both take local elections with a slight pinch of salt, because we know that there can be one local issue that is absolute fire for one party and lets in everybody else, and it's very unique and for that locality only. So it's hard to look at local elections and see a bigger picture, but obviously there's a pattern.
Yeah, ULEZ in Uxbridge by-election, for example, in London.
The Conservatives never thought they were going to win Uxbridge, ever, did they? Let's be fair about it. They pretty much thought that was going Labour, and that was a surprise win because they came out strongly against ULEZ. So yes, there are localised issues that are hot topics. But having said that, the Lib Dems did gain 12 more councils in the local elections last time round. Mid-Bedfordshire, which was a bit of a hodgepodge really, wasn't it, of independents and Lib Dems. I mean, the Conservatives did tremendously badly, but so did Labour. But then if you look at the seats that Labour put up in the local elections, actually they didn't put up everywhere. So that's what I mean about it's quite difficult to judge, because it would be easier to judge if all parties were standing everywhere, because that would give you a clearer picture of actually what's happening. So yes, Mid-Bedfordshire, interesting one. Don't think it'll be Lib Dem, but I might have to eat my hat on that. I think it's far more likely to be Labour. I can't see the Conservatives keeping it. But again, we might be surprised. There doesn't seem to be the hot issue in Mid-Beds that there have been in the other by-elections. So everybody's kind of having to make their own ground there where they can. But it'll be interesting to see.
It might be just a good old case of who works the hardest.
It might, yes. And that doesn't mean the person who delivers the most pieces of paper either.
No. And the Nadine Dorries factor. Maybe people use this as an opportunity, as a bit of a protest about perhaps the way she exited politics.
Quite possibly.
But this isn't the Nadine Dorries show this week, you'll be pleased to hear. It's all about the Lib Dems in party conference. So you mentioned Europe. We both agree on that. That's a bit of a wedge issue, potentially, for the electorate going forward. But they've kind of missed that opportunity at the moment. But hey-ho, that might change as we approach a general election because you've alluded for the speech. It's the speech for now. Perhaps it's not the speech for later on down the road. I mean, what was your experience in Brussels when it came to Lib Dem MEPs? Did you sort of work with them, to brush up against them every so often?
Not particularly, only because of the way the groupings work in Brussels, that basically it's kind of like political parties in a way, but you have them for mass countries. So, you know, the EPP ED is what the Conservatives were part of until they created their own offshoot, which was the ECR. I think Lib Dems sit in Aldi or something.
Isn't that
like
a supermarket?
It is.
Very popular in this family, but others are available. Lidl, Tesco, Morrison, Sainsbury's.
Yeah, so they're, or is it Aldo? Something like that. They're part of that group. So yes, we didn't really rub up with them that much. Obviously, you know, the assistance from other UK MEPs, because you kind of stick together and learn from each other, especially when it comes to kind of different processes and how you work through all the committees and things. But no, we weren't particularly kind of close to the Lib Dems particularly.
No, but they always did pretty well in European elections, that's for reasons that we explained. They're pro-Europe, which is fine, you know. They had a position, bit unclear about what their position is now. Now, it was great to see on the front row of Ed Davey's speech, Richard Ford MP, who was elected in the Tiverton and Honiton by-election and is a veteran, an army officer veteran, friend of the show, having interviewed him in the past. Do look it up. Interviewed him in Parliament. Really nice guy, super warm, friendly, engaging, and is the Lib Dems spokesman on defence.
Yeah.
But you mentioned at the start of this podcast that the speech was more about what was missing rather than what was in it, and that was one of the things that was missing.
Yeah.
Defence, Ukraine.
Yeah, nothing. Not a word, not a bean. Nothing on defence. At a time that arguably we're under a lot of external threat, both from Russia and China, and absolutely no mention of Ukraine. I would like to know what the Lib Dem view is on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and our current agreement to provide weaponry and training in that conflict, but not a whisker on that.
Again, bit of a missed opportunity. We've just had a change of Defence Secretary. My old boss, Grant Shapps, now in the hot seat.
Yeah.
And I know from interviewing Richard Ford that they broadly were in agreement with the government's position on Ukraine. But it was an opportunity perhaps to have some commentary about that changing of the guard between Wallace and Shapps. But there was nothing on that. So politically, that was a bit of a missed opportunity, if I'm honest. And nothing on Ukraine, which we know that people still really care about in this country. So I was surprised there was nothing on that at all. What else was missing in the speech?
Oh, gosh. What else was missing? What else did
What would you have liked to have seen in the speech from the Lib Dems?
There was nothing about parents.
Yeah, I was going to say the family's missing.
Yeah, family's completely missing, which is unusual because normally the Lib Dems have something about families, and especially as the government have recently made some childcare announcements. Did they pull the rug from under the Lib Dems? Is it something that therefore the Lib Dems would have spoken about, but actually the Conservatives have kind of taken it, owned it and run with it? I don't know. So yeah, that was completely missing. There wasn't actually that much about the environment either. There was a few mentions about sewage, and that was pretty much it. Nothing about kind of microplastics, and especially when the government I know everybody's focused at the moment on Rishi rescinding some of the net zero stuff. They've been focusing on the whole electric cars thing and wind. But for me, because you know how much I hate plastic, they've actually gone back on charging companies who use excessive plastic in their packaging, which is huge.
Who's they? You mean the government?
The government. No mention of that in the Lib Dems. No one's actually holding the government to account on that. And they are slowly but surely shifting, the government are slowly but surely shifting their position back on environmental matters at a time that it's in everyone's kind of conscious. And the Lib Dems haven't picked up on that in their conference speech at all, even though timing-wise, it was a couple of weeks ago that announcement was made and fell last week. So he's had plenty of time to kind of build that in. So I find that very strange. But I was delighted to see, finally, someone making the link between the economy and health. I think he did really well on that. I was really pleased to see that, because as anybody knows, if you've got healthy employees, they are more productive.
Yeah.
If you have got some of your workforce off on sick, they're less productive. So I thought actually that was a really interesting link that he made, and the right link to make. And I quite liked, albeit it's quite cheeky to do it, but I quite liked the fact he used some of the Conservative slogans against them. The country isn't working and get Britain working was two that I think historically have been used ever since Such and Such. He came up with them in the 80s. So I thought that was quite good. But yes, I think everything he kind of talked about around the economy, the whole families parenting thing aside, was fairly good.
Okay, so before we perhaps get your ratings out of 10 on the speech, just as a little reminder to listeners of the show, you can become a supporter of the Veterans in Politics podcast by going into our notes, and for the cost of about a cup of, let's just say a cup of London coffee, so about 2 cups of Shire County's Market Towns coffee, and about half a London pint, but a full pint in Wetherspoons in your local town, you can become a supporter on a monthly basis. That means that it keeps this show going, enables us to improve our technology, our output, and also gets us around the country to go and interview the guests that you want on this show. So without that support, I can't do this. I do this on my own, with a little bit of help from my wife, and people's generosity with their stories. So go to the notes below where you can become one of our supporters. Failing that, a really easy thing you can do is by subscribing to this show on your podcast provider, telling a friend. Data from Ofcom tells us that people get their podcasts from recommendations from those they trust in their house, their friends, their family. So get the show, put the link, and WhatsApp it, email it, social media it to one of your friends. That means we can reach more people and get this show growing, so we can go after the heels of the rest of politics and and all these other amazing podcasts as an independent show. That would be the absolute world to me. Anyway, sales pitch over. And we'll get back to Lydia's analysis of of Ed Davey's speech and the Lib Dem conference. So in terms of content, policy, what would you give it out of 10?
Yeah, I'd give him an 8. It would be higher, but there's some major gaps.
Okay, it's quite generous. I'm probably going to give him about a 7.
Okay.
And delivery, style and delivery.
Oh, I think he needs to work on that. I think he really needs to work on that. That is the one thing letting him down at the moment. This is really harsh, but probably 3 or 4.
Wow.
For style and delivery. It was just flat for me.
You are the Craig Revel Hall when it comes to that.
I give and I taketh away. I'm
going to be a little bit more generous. I'm going to give him about 6. If you were to take the cancer story in isolation, I would have given him about an 8 or a 9, because it was really genuine, good storytelling. But in its entirety, yeah, mid-table there for style and substance there. Duration of the speech.
I think it was too long. I do think it was too long. I think you have lost people at that sort of length, especially because he didn't keep the momentum throughout. And you're right, if he'd started off with the cancer story and kept that level of momentum throughout the whole thing, perfect. But he started on a joke that then dropped, it pootled along, and then it picked up again. Yeah. I think he just needs to talk about things he's passionate about.
Okay, yeah, I agree. And he's got plenty of those. When we've heard him on other podcasts, there are some stories in there. A bit like Keir Starmer, though. He's also got some good things in his story that he just doesn't bring out often enough in his backstory. But that will be for a future podcast when we do some analysis on the final speech. Next week, we go off to analysis of the Conservative Party conference. She and I have been to many of those over the years. We're not there this year because the Invictus Games dictated family life this year. And then we finish up the analysis with Labour. We've both been to the Labour Party, and indeed we held an event with Campaign Force, not-for-profit there, and a panel discussion with Dan Jarvis last year. So you can look back on both our events at Conservative Party and Labour Party conference from previous years. Didn't go to Lib Dems because it was called off, but we were planning to. But there's plenty of content about us at party conferences in back catalogue of the Veterans in Politics podcast. Now, before we go, quick fire round. So I like to do these with you because they're a bit of fun. So we're going to go for accommodation, party conference accommodation, notoriously bad.
Hard to get.
Hard to get as well. Expensive. Cheers, big chains, for bumping your prices up. Premier Inn, Travelodge, or good old fashioned B&B or Spoons. What would be your preferred?
Oh no. See, I do. You know how much I love B&B.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna go B&B. I'm gonna keep with that.
Including Airbnb, though I did try and get ripped off when I went to Conservative conference last year. Airbnb, it was a scam, and they managed my money back. So do be careful, kids, when booking your Airbnbs out there. There are some nasty people who will take advantage of things like conferences. Okay, party conference, notorious for alcohol. I pretty much decided that I was going to cut down my drinking to almost zero after party conference last year. But lukewarm white wine or a toxic red, what would be your tipple of choice, or something else?
So, well, I've also joined you in the kind of not really drinking alcohol anymore. But I think at party conference, I'd rather go for a toxic red because it's harder for them to get the red wrong at conference, whereas the white,
Yeah, pretty nasty whites. And another great story from Labour conference where Alex Lee, friend of the show and previous guest, he and I had a bit of a dispute with the hotel around the wine that we'd ordered for the event, and had to smuggle out some wine that we'd paid for, as well as getting a refund from that chain, who I won't mention for legal reasons. And favourite conference speech?
Actually, that's quite easy for me, and I was there. Was Cameron's speech in Blackpool, where he delivered it with no notes, no auto cue. It was very impassioned, and I remember leaving it, just everyone was absolutely buzzing. 2007,
I was there too. We didn't know each other.
No, didn't even see each other.
Maybe just brush shoulders over some lukewarm white wine or a toxic red. And I agree. It was high stakes. Gordon Brown, if he'd called a general election then, would have won it, had a walkover, but didn't. And David Cameron wouldn't have been party leader, wouldn't have been Prime Minister unless he absolutely nailed that speech. It was brilliant. But I'd also go back to the 2006 Obama speech at the Democratic National Congress. No one knew who he was.
Oh, yeah.
And he gave an absolute barnstormer of a speech. Do look up that one as well. Worst conference speech?
Again, dead easy, and we were in the room for this.
Together,
both kind of jaw agape, I think. Liz Truss gave a speech about pork markets and about putting the apple back at the top of the tree, which it absolutely doesn't grow at. That was just the most atrocious speech I've ever been to.
I think she was Environment Secretary at the time.
I think she was, yeah.
And I remember nudging you and going, who is this?
Is she serious? Was our first thing.
We didn't really know her, and I'm being
parody?
I'm being unkind to supporters of Liz Truss here for a second, but let's not forget she was round the cabinet table and became Prime Minister of this country. But her delivery, I don't think it's improved much. At Conservative Party conference last year, I remember her walking in the room, well, vaguely remember, when she was Prime Minister, and the room carried on. Yeah. Whereas in previous Prime Ministers, particularly David Cameron, you knew he was in the room before you'd even seen him, because the atmosphere changed. Everything stopped. everything carried on when Liz Truss walked in the room, and that's my own personal objective opinion of that, and that's how I felt.
The same will be when Rishi enters the room, unfortunately.
Well, let us know, conference goers. What's it like when Rishi walks into the room? We'll see. What's it like indeed when Ed Davey or Keir Starmer walk in the room? Because I've not been in those rooms either. Let us know. And yeah, that's our end of our Lib Dem analysis. Hopefully you enjoyed that little look from our experience of going to party conferences and our review on what Ed Davey had to say in terms of his policy, his delivery, what this means in terms of the wider politics of it all, because it always has a meaning, who his target audience was. And we look forward to doing some similar analysis for both the Labour Party and Conservative Party conferences in the coming weeks. So do hit subscribe, make sure you follow the show. We've also got a whole raft of stories coming up from veterans in politics, already interviewed, in the can, ready for release. So we've got loads of content coming up in the coming weeks. So it's not just about me and her chuntering on. We've also got some other veterans in politics. And this feature, Behind the Politics, will continue too, with some other guests lined up to interview, including journalists behind the scenes of politics. Hope you've enjoyed this. Hit subscribe, and remember, stand up and serve again. Any final thoughts?
No.
Enjoy that?
Good. Yeah,
good. Me too.
It's good.
Oh, it's good in this house, isn't it? We get to lust of the romantics, us. See you soon. Thanks to our guests, and thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, hit subscribe now. Alternatively, you can support our mission by checking out in the show notes below, where you can rate, donate, or become our mate. Thank you.